Okay. Hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar, where we're going to present you some of the details on the practical guidance on the application of food allergen quantitative risk assessment within food operations. Second, as a small introduction, my name is Torben König. I am a scientific project manager at LC Europe, and we are a branch of the International Life Science Institute, which is a global non-profit federation. At ILSI, we have an aim, and that is to convene the best scientists from industry, academia, and the public sector to deliver, communicate, and disseminate science-based solutions. These solutions then actually should ensure that foods are safe, nutritious, and sustainable. Moreover, they should also improve planetary and human health in the 21st century. Before going to the event schedule, a small technical hint. If you have any question, already ask them in the chat during the presentations. And towards the end of the seminar, there's going to be a Q&A session in which we're going to address the questions that have been posted in the chat. Okay, Ben, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Torben. So I would like to first start by thanking everyone for joining today. I'm requesting some remote control of the slides, so that will take a second for me to get through. So I'm going to walk you through a bit of an introduction to our expert group if this is your first webinar with us. If you've been with us for the entire 2.5 journey, it's going to be a small review and reintroduction. And then we're going to go through some specific sections of the guidance and the main chapters, and have a few speakers, including myself, Dr. Marty Bloom from TNO, Neil Buck from General Mills, and Renee Cravel, formerly of Unilever and now an independent consultant, covering different parts of the guidance that we've developed, and then have a chunk of time at the end for questions and answers. I've been lucky enough to be the leader of this expert group for the last 2.5 years, and therefore I'll take you through the beginning here. So it's been recognized for a while that there's increasing interest in integration of risk assessment and potentially QRA as part of allergen management. However, if you've had any discussions about risk assessment on any level, there's usually differing opinions, and it's clear that not all risk assessments are the same, and QRA is not always the answer. So it's not always necessary or appropriate or even feasible to do a QRA. So since we've had this lack of consensus on the deployment of different methods, that was part of the reason that LC set up this expert group, is to start to get some consensus and harmonization and help get some guidance out there on how it may be used when you need to use it. So it was established as an expert group in early 2020, and we were really working to improve the overall implementation of QRA if it was necessary across the entire food production chain. And a big reason for this was harmonization of the reasoning that feeds into all of your decision-making processes, whether it's for labeling or potential recalls or cleaning procedures, but looking at how you gather the data for risk assessment and harmonize part of that data gathering process, or at least be able to have discussions on similar levels. The output that we've had is a practical guidance, and it is now available online. I believe the link was in the webinar reminder that you saw this morning. If not, we're going to spam you again at the end of this with another link so that you're able to download it. Torben might also be sharing the slides with you after this, so then you're able to grab this link as well. But it's out there, it's available, it's freely accessible. I highly encourage you to go find it, download it, and read the full guidance. And I wanted to give you a very colorful ILSI color scheme of our past 2.5 years, where we went through the development starting in February 2020. You see lots of different webinars or stakeholder events where we were asking questions, gathering feedback, developing the guidance. We broke off into mini stakeholder workshops, mini events with specific subsections, needed real specific feedback on certain sections of the guidance, had multiple complete stakeholder events over the last year, and then including a testing and review period to finish the guidance. you can see already there was a lot going on, and we wanted to put that on screen to give you an idea of the work that went into this. We calculated just in meeting times, there was over 3,500 meeting hours for all the participants, or all the hours totaled up. So that's over 430 working days just in meeting time. And that doesn't include the working hours for actual creation of the peer-reviewed publication that came out of this, or the practical guidance. So you can easily imagine that there's almost 10,000 hours gone into this expert group for creation of everything there. Again, project outputs, we have a peer-reviewed paper that was based on our first stakeholder group meeting and the concepts that were being developed, as well as our practical guidance. And our stakeholder group included a bit of everybody. So we had feedback coming from the industry, from the academic world, food safety authorities, clinical world, dietitians, you had patient organizations, research organizations, consultants, and then national federations, all coming together to give us feedback on different sections of the guidance. And personally, I really enjoyed the open and honest feedback. If you hear looks great, that's not always as good as we really think this could use some improvement. And we heard a lot of that through the last 2 years, and it's really got the guidance to where it is now. So I want to thank everybody for their very open and honest feedback during this process. We had split into 3 working groups, really looking at 2 distinct risk assessment categories, the proactive risk assessments and reactive risk assessments. Proactive assessments being done under normal conditions for food production, maybe looking at your upstream supply chains or in-house production. Reactive risk assessments being part of an allergen incident response. And you can imagine across these different sections, you could have different questions being asked, different urgencies for data gathering, or potentially different data and information being needed. So as we split into those 3 groups, those were main chapters in our guidance. So after the introduction, we have a section on communication across the supply chain. We have a section based on the management of operations or the management of incidents, as well as overarching core concepts regarding different things that can carry across risk assessments. And we're going to have Marty talk to you about the management of operations, Neil talk to you about the management of incidents, and Renee talk to you about the core concept sections today. And I'll carry you through briefly through the communication across supply chains. So we have a full half an hour coming up, and then we have some time for those questions and answers at the end. Again, as Torben said, if any questions come up during the presentation, please throw them in that chat box, and then we'll be able to address them during the Q&A. So very briefly about communication across supply chains. We had an objective to enable better communication between ingredient suppliers and users of those ingredients. Part of that was to define the type of information that needs to be gathered so that it could serve as an input for a total supply chain QRA if necessary, or practically speaking, what info do you need and to which level of detail to make an allergen risk assessment framework applicable or possible. And then if we were defining the level of detail that's needed, we also wanted to give a bit of guidance on how to obtain that required information. So within this chapter, you have some sections on global regulatory aspects. You can imagine that not every country has the same allergen requirements. That's daily life in the food industry. So we highlight that a bit and give some tips and insights on how to deal with that. The different information requirements to enable a QRA, as well as the requiring that information, how do you find it? Supply chains are broad, complex, and anything that we do here has to strike that balance between what's best in class versus what's feasible. And this isn't intended to be a cut and paste system. So it's crucial to remember that a thoughtful process is needed, and each situation is going to be a little bit unique, and you're not just able to run through and cut and paste the same thing everywhere. So be open for conversations, slightly different approaches, and really manage each one individually. And finally, I just wanted to give you a small insight to some of the things that are in there. This is an example table, which for us helps to put people at the same level of information when speaking. Some of us coming from the analytical world might very well know milligram per kilogram or ppm equivalents, part per million. Coming from the food industry, product development, you might be looking at percentage of inclusion in a recipe, and have very different levels of language for what is a low level or what is a high level. And I think some of you can relate that you'll hear, no, we have really low levels of protein, it's only 1%. A 1% protein is 10,000 parts per million or 10,000 milligrams per kilogram. In the allergen world, 10,000 is very high. So having that translation between percentage and milligram per kilogram equivalents is something very basic, something that a lot of us already do mentally day to day, but you'd be surprised how many people don't have that in front of them, and when they see it, it's, oh, okay, so that is a high level for allergens. So this was just one basic example of the practical information you can take from the guidance and share with colleagues or others that you're working with. This is the last slide that I have, and I'm going to pass it off now to Marcy Bloom, and she's going to talk to you about QRA within the management of operations.
So this presentation will show you the guidance on QRA within management of operations in a few slides. It's about proactive assessment for allergens in food production under normal conditions in-house, so in contrast to, for instance, an incident where you are much more reactive. It's on allergen risk management to reduce allergen cross-contact, and only in the case the scale of the risk cannot be avoided, then a PAL may be applied. And it's for food business operators validating their production process. The objective for the guidance is to support in deciding how and where quantitative risk assessment is appropriate and feasible in the management of operations. So general allergen control and options for allergen risk management other than the quantitative risk assessment are only briefly indicated to avoid duplication with the existing guidance already out there. And it's really focused on the quantitative risk assessment application. The guidance is set up in the context of normal existing HCCP food safety programs and assuming a good manufacturing practice in place. There are three sections of the guidance. The first section is an introduction to quantitative risk assessment within allergen control programs. The second is an extensive guide on quantitative risk assessment within site cross-contact, and the approach is briefly indicated in the next few slides. The third section is on validation and verification of cleaning, because that's a very important control for to minimize crossover of allergens in your production. As indicated, HCCP-based risk analysis is the starting point for the guidance, and then focused on allergens. And it identifies allergen controls which will require validation to determine their effectiveness. And the type of validation that is done will lead to what kind of data is available. And those data can be qualitative or quantitative. So it starts with step 1, identification of the hazard, so the identification of the possible allergen cross-contact, by mapping the process and identifying sources and points of potential cross-contact in the production. Here you see a scheme where the production of one product is set up, and for each point it's indicated whether there is a potential for allergen cross-contact. In the next step, the risk is identified. What is the risk at that specific point? Also taking into account the employees, the method, the materials and the machinery in place for that specific production step. And everything should be documented. In step 2, the chance of occurrence is determined, so the likelihood of cross-contact for each of the individual process steps for that production, and it's indicated whether it's low or high, medium. Other terminology can be not likely, remote, or likely, probable. So for each of those steps, this is indicated, and this, of course, depends on the controls already in place to minimize this potential cross-contact. And here you also have indication of what type of data is available. For instance, if it's a good receipts check, then this control determines that the data is qualitative. Whether if when it's giving information on cleaning of equipment, then you can have quantitative data. In step 3, the hazard is characterized of all those steps where the risk was likely or probable. The key features to take into account here are allergen protein concentration of the specific allergen, the physical form of the allergen, and the amount likely to contribute to the cross-contact. And the core concepts chapters give a lot of guidance on how to do that and what to take in consideration. Step 4 is on the validation of controls. Here you validate whether the control measures in place are minimizing the risk of cross-contact or that other ones should be implemented. That it can be qualitative input for assessing the residual risk, but those are insufficient for quantitative risk assessment, or samples are taken which provide quantitative input for doing a risk assessment. And the guidance is giving information on the relevance of each of the sample types, for instance, a swab or the finished product, when doing a quantitative risk assessment. The validation of controls is continued in the chapter on validation and verification of cleaning, because cleaning is an important control measure to minimize the risk of carryover from one production to the next production, and guidance is given on application of quantitative risk assessment in the cleaning validation. It's a step-by-step approach to carry out this validation exercise, and considerations are given for allergen analysis to demonstrate the effectiveness of the cleaning procedure. Now, an example for such a step-by-step approach is given in this scheme, where you see the steps that should be taken for the production with the allergen to the production without the allergen, and the steps to take to demonstrate that the cleaning procedure is effective. Now, summarizing, the chapter on QRA in management of operations is providing information and guidance on systemizing the collection of information, the process, and what type of output you have. It uses a case study and many examples to explain what is present in the guidance. There is extensive reference to the relevant chapters. The approach taken is an HCCP-based risk analysis focused on allergen, and it identifies the type of risk assessment that is appropriate and possible at each of the steps.
Okay, thank you for joining, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about the incident section of the guidance. Requesting control. Okay, great. Yeah, so as Marty mentioned, what we aim to do in the overall guidance is to systematize as much as possible the process of collecting information. That's very much what we've tried to do with the incident section. If I can just go to the incident section, there we go. So what do we mean by incidents? Incidents are the presence or even potential presence of an allergen which has not been previously accounted for in allergen management plans. And it may be associated with the food that has been produced, distributed, or even marketed. And therefore it requires normally a rapid risk assessment to inform risk management decision making. And often in the case of incidents, you're dealing with a paucity of data but the data evolves as the knowledge of the incident investigation progresses. So our objective, as mentioned, was really to systematize as much as possible the process that you go through in terms of collecting information, making a judgment over what risk assessment is appropriate and possible with an incident, but also importantly, capturing and communicating the outcome of the incident, including the uncertainty associated with the risk assessment. So incidents can come to you from any point in the supply chain, from the upstream, from your operations, or from the downstream. So for example, it's not that unusual for a supplier in the upstream to notify you that an ingredient that has been supplied actually has a changed cross-contact warning associated with it, and you may have used that ingredient within your production operations, and so you need to do a rapid risk assessment. Or alternatively, from the downstream, you may have information coming made aware from a customer or even an authority in terms of analytical data, or you may through your consumer contact procedures have a consumer contact which could be associated with an allergic reaction. And actually in this section of the guidance, we go into some detail in terms of understanding whether a consumer contact may be associated with an allergen incident or may be associated with your products, etc., and the checklist of questions and data that you need to capture as you go through that process. So it won't be a surprise for you to hear that we identified that there is a clear stepwise process as you go through managing an incident. So firstly, in terms of the type of incident that you're faced with, you need to take some immediate actions, and much of that is around understanding really what is the reality that the incident has happened and what's the scenario that has resulted in that incident. And if it's clear that an incident has happened, what you should do in terms of capturing data such that you can analyze that data and make a decision on what type of assessment is appropriate and possible, and of course, communicating the outcome of that. So guiding the user through those fundamental steps, we have a flow chart which asks questions as you go through it. And for each of these parts of the flow chart, there is a guidance on how to understand how to answer those questions. So what I'll do is go over some specific parts of the flow chart and the guided process to give you a flavor of what's in the incident section. So fundamental to the first part, so the immediate reactions to an incident, is this understanding of what is the chance of occurrence of the cross contact. What's the reality of it? Is it actually something that you know is happening, or is it just circumstantial evidence? So associated with that, and in line with trying to systematize the process, we have identified different types of chance of occurrence. So it could be either high, medium, low, or unknown, defined what we mean by that, and then propose what the next step should be. If you have, for example, a high chance of occurrence, where it's more likely than not that unintended allergen presence has or will occur, then obviously you'd want to proceed with the next steps of the assessment. Whereas if you have a low chance of occurrence, it may be that you want to gather more data before proceeding into the actual assessment part of the guidance. And of course, it's important to point out that in this immediate part of the incident assessment, if it becomes obvious that there is a cross contact or a mistake that has happened in production that is resulting in little doubt that there is a risk to the consumer, then of course you don't progress further through all the steps of the process. You immediately go to communicating the outcome of that risk. Okay. So if we look at the data capture part, again, what we've tried to do is systematize this as much as possible. So what we've done is, as well as capturing the data, we've tried to identify different levels, different tiers of refinement, or different levels of quality of evidence. So one of the fundamentals in terms of managing an incident is what we call the tier of refinement. So where you are on the progress as the incident develops. So it may be, for example, that you're at a very early stage, so tier 1, where you have a first indication that there is a potential incident that's happening, but it may not be affecting your specific supply chain. So there may be some knowledge generally that there is from a particular region a peanut cross contact that may be happening in the garlic supply chain, but you're not clear that it's affecting your specific supply chain. That's at one end. And then at the other end, in terms of a high tier of refinement, you can actually have data available on your finished product. So that's what we termed a higher or tier 4 tier of refinement. So again, this is all attempting to systematize the process of understanding where you are in the incident and the quality of evidence. So we also have this quality of evidence framework, which not only captures knowledge around the fundamental characteristics of cross contact, be it the form of cross contact, the distribution, the frequency, the quantity or concentration, but also the uncertainty associated with those parameters. So you could have a form of cross contact which is amorphous, but there may be some uncertainty that that is the case. And associated with the uncertainty, we've developed a scoring system so that you can have an overall picture of what is the uncertainty associated with your fundamental parameters, your characteristics of cross contact. Now, if you move forward with that data into the decision-making process of deciding what type of assessment is appropriate, what you can do is actually compare the tier of refinement to where you are in the incident knowledge of the incident that's happening, the incident process, with the overall data uncertainty. And this is indicative only, but it's to guide the user that if you have, a high quality of evidence, then it may be appropriate to do a quantitative risk assessment, whereas with a medium quality of evidence, be it from a tier 2 level of refinement and a medium overall data uncertainty, it may be more appropriate to do a qualitative risk assessment. So it's a very kind of systematic guided process that we're going through. And then of course there's an outcome from all of this. So capturing and communicating in a way that's meaningful to the risk management community. So there are 3 fundamental outcomes, of course: that there is a risk to allergic consumers, that risk is within agreed limits of acceptability, or it's not currently possible to determine. And associated with each of those 3 fundamental outputs, you have a quality of evidence. So the risk could be within agreed limits of acceptability, but you could have a low quality of evidence, and then captured within the form, you'd have the next steps that you would undertake to increase the quality of your evidence, should time be available to do that. Or if not, then what you would communicate to the risk manager. Okay, so fundamentally, the section of the guidance on incident assessment aims at systematizing the collection of information, the process you go through, and then the output. It facilitates a rapid risk assessment, and it identifies the type of risk assessment that may be appropriate and possible. And fundamentally, it captures and communicates the outcome of the risk assessment, including the uncertainty around it. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to the next speaker, which is, I understand, René.
Yes, it is indeed. Thank you, Neil. Am I in control now? No. My slide's not moving, Torben, yet. Ah, right. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Actually, it's been very helpful having Neil just before, because he's explained in some detail some of the concepts which I'm going to refer to, in fact. The overarching core concepts, which is section 5 in the guidance, are concepts which are common to all allergen risk assessments, including quantitative risk assessment. And we've provided in that section brief reference materials which are intended to be used in combination with other sections rather than as standalones. And we've grouped the core concepts as described in the boxes here. Whoops, let's hope it works. Yeah, right. Now, looking at taking each concept in turn there, we'll start with unintended allergen presence scenarios and characteristics. And the first question one asks actually in those is actually, what is the chance of occurrence of UAP in the circumstances you're looking at actually? And Neil has explained actually some of the uncertainties explained associated with that. Once you've determined actually the chance of occurrence and particularly decided that you can do a risk assessment, you need to consider form, distribution of UAP within the product of interest, the UAP concentration, of course, but also the frequency with which UAP may occur. And that's different from the chance. I mean, it may be, for instance, that you're using a number of suppliers for raw material, and some of them may have different allergen management performance. So with one, you might expect to find the allergen, and others not. Right, we'll move on from that. Now, looking at it in more detail, we've got amorphous and particulate forms of UAP, which may be distributed either homogeneously or heterogeneously. And adding to that, and I think again is very helpful, Neil went through this, there's an associated uncertainty with the, or certainty with the evaluation that you've made there, which is well described here. Right. Now, looking at the influence of UAP characteristics on the calculation method, these are somewhat critical as they determine, in fact, whether you can ultimately do a quantitative risk assessment or whether you can only do a qualitative one. And it is, I think, pertinent actually to mention here because for many years the dogma has been around that particulates meant only qualitative risk assessments could be made, but we've actually provided guidance as to how quantitative risk assessments can be done with particulate forms of allergen where possible. And of course, when you can do a quantitative risk assessment, then you have the guidance to compare those with established tolerable risk measures, such as reference doses. Right. Analyzing a product to find out is one way of finding out how much an intended allergen is present in that particular product. And I'm sure it will not come as a surprise to this particular audience that it's much more than just taking a sample and sending it to a lab and getting a number back. But unfortunately, I think there are some in the community which still believe that's an appropriate way of doing things. Instead, you first of all, when thinking of analysis, need to think about why you want to do the analysis. Then once you've done that, you need to think about how you sample, the type of test you need to use, the test method, and what performance criteria may be required. And that could be a discussion with, should be a discussion with the laboratory, unless you've already had it on previous occasions. And that hopefully will give you a result which is useful for your risk assessment and which you can interpret. But before we leave analysis, it's also possible to estimate carryover to do a first pass risk assessment, an approximation, which may be sufficient in the circumstances. It's important given that analysis is actually demanding and also fairly onerous. So for some companies may be quite demanding in that respect as well. So for instance, you may actually be able to weigh the residual material carried over after different cleaning protocols to determine where you are. That could also enable you to focus analysis more precisely. Whoops. Now, yes, so this flowchart actually describes some of the thinking actually and takes you through from whether you actually need analysis in the first place, right through to the risk assessment, to the input to the risk assessment. I would like to draw attention to the fact, of course, that yes, once you've decided analysis is necessary, you may still end up not doing it because you may find that whatever sampling you can do cannot give you representative material, in which case, if you did analysis, you would end up with misleading results, and that would not be a good thing. So that's where I think I want to move on from that. Whoops, right. One particular aspect which we discussed in quite some detail actually is sampling. For practical purposes, I think it's fair to say that sampling plans for allergens are not available. And we've tried to provide some guidance and help to in this particular sector, basically indicating how many samples would be useful depending on the criticality of the result that you're obtaining. So when you've got high criticality, such as a risk assessment or particularly a claim validation, like a free-from validation, then you would require more samples quite clearly than if you were just doing routine verification of ingredients. Oops, yeah. Now, the final variable that is necessary for the risk assessment is how much allergen, unintentionally present allergen, is consumed by at a single eating occasion. Now, that is a key metric, actually, because allergens are, rather allergic reactions are immediate reactions taking place over a short period of time. Now, the first thought may be that it could be portion size, but it often isn't portion size, and the flow diagram provides guidance as to decide between using portion size and using other measures. And there are data sets which have been developed for allergen risk assessments in the context, for instance, of the European project IFAM. And they feature the appropriate percentiles, which actually relate to the tolerable risk established for the analysis. And they may be P75 or P50 values. If you don't have access to those data sets, and most likely in many circumstances it wouldn't be possible, there are databases of national reference amounts consumed. They exist in the USA and Canada and other jurisdictions. I think the EFSA database can also fall into that particular category. But just one word of warning concerning those is that the P50s or P75s or the other p-values that they present refer generally to daily intake amounts rather than, they're not specific to the single eating occasions that are important in allergen risk assessment. So what I haven't put here on the slide actually is that once you've got all these data together, you can do some simple basic calculations to estimate the risk under various scenarios actually. And I think with that I can, that's my last slide. So do I need to give up?
Yeah, so I'm going to pop back on and take this moment to thank Renee, Neil, and Marty for sharing all of those details about the different sections of the guidance. I hope that's giving you some insights to pieces of what's available. I was reminded by someone in a direct message, it's over 180 pages of a guidance. So what we've been able to show you today is just the surface level, and there's a lot of different pieces that you can use, and maybe not all of it at one moment in time, but definitely different sections which can be applicable at different parts for you. I've been talking for a little bit to see and give you a moment to formulate a question or two. If you have it typed out in the chat, that would be great. And otherwise, if there's possibly a reaction, to raise a hand, and then we can turn on some microphones and get some questions that way. All right, I have a question from Sophia.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the talk, and great to finally see you after reading all your publications. Concerning actually the very last slide regarding the P50 or P75 percentile, if I would be using the EFSA comprehensive database, it only lists the P50. So it would be appropriate to use the P50 since the P75 isn't included, right?
Yeah, that's a practical solution in the beginning to use the P50, and 99.3% 5% of the time, the P50 was also as conservative as the P75. And as René's got his microphone on, we discussed this also at the FAO-WHO expert consultation. And the P50 seems to be protective for whether you're using those reference doses or other reference doses out there.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes,
I was going to mention that if you hadn't.
Great. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Could I get the others who spoke to turn their cameras on as well, just so I'm not the only one responding? Thank you.
Oh, yes.
All right, we have a question coming from the chat there. It says, based on 2 years of work and involvement, what's your reflection on how this guidance will impact the amount of PAL that is used? I might deflect that a bit to Neil, as he's actually in the industry and seeing how a guidance such as this might affect decisions at a company such as his or some people he interacts with. Oh, convenient with the microphone not working. So my default answer on this is it's not always that the amount of PAL will decrease or increase, but you're looking at the reasoning behind potential application of PAL and the justified labeling. You would hope that that is increased in anything that is not justified precautionary labeling is decreasing. So the overall amount of labeling, it's hard to say if that would stay the same or decrease, but hopefully the amount of justified labeling increases and the amount of trust in labeling is able to increase.
Yeah, is the microphone working now?
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, it's working.
we certainly have the gremlins with us, don't we? This afternoon, different issues, but yeah. No, I mean this is a very important part of what is a much larger process, of course, in terms of moving away from the binary approach of what not. Well, I shouldn't say moving away from, but building on top of the binary approach of either it's there or it's not, in terms of a better understanding of what's happening, particularly in the upstream supply chain. Because one of the fundamentals around implementing quantitative risk assessment is that you need to have a really good understanding of what's happening in the upstream. So irrespective of actually whether you're doing the quantitative calculations or they're helping you in specific circumstances, it's always a benefit to have a much better understanding of what's happening in your upstream, and then you can base any risk management actions such as precautionary labeling on solid foundations. But this is just a part of a much bigger landscape of moving towards a more risk-based precautionary labeling landscape.
Yeah, if I could add something to that, I think there could also be an impact if the, I suppose, regulatory legal status of PAL and what is required to apply it changes as well. But that's, of course, outside the industry. That's not industry itself.
Okay, I have another question I'm going to send first at Neil and then see if the others want to jump in. And it was coming in a direct message if you haven't seen it. So it was asking if you have a data point or an analytical test that shows the presence, low level presence of an allergen in the final product. Do you immediately need to take action? Or how much more data should you get if you have in a positive test, but at a low level?
Okay, so we're talking, the context is incidence there, I guess.
The context is incidence there. You have a low level positive test in a consumer product. Yeah,
well, if you have a analytical data on a finished consumer product, then it's quite likely that you could do a quantitative risk assessment, assuming that you have a reasonable certainty that that data point is reflective of what's happening within the product that's presumably been marketed.
And to poke a little bit, how do you know it's reflective of the other the other products out there, or how many
Yeah.
samples would you need before you know it is reflective?
Yeah, to my mind, the first thing that you think about is, well, what is the scenario that is potentially that's resulting in that cross contact, the presence of the previously unaccounted for allergen. So if you have no knowledge whatsoever of what is the scenario that's resulting in the presence of that allergen, then obviously then the if you only have a single data point, the uncertainty around that data point is going to be quite large. But if you have a reasonable understanding actually of what's happened in the supply chain to result in that cross contact, then you can understand what the characteristics of that cross contact could be, including its concentration, its form, its distribution, etc. And therefore, you'd be a bit more comfortable in relying on a low number of data points in the finished product. But if you really have a poor understanding of what's happened in the supply chain, then you would want a larger number of data points to understand, you know, what is the range and what's the worst case, etc. But
Okay, thank you. I have a question I'll send to Renee. It could really be for any of us. But they were asking, as Ilse was creating this working group and in creating this document, who the document is pitched at. Is it looking for SMEs or larger organizations such as the ones that are on the expert group?
I would say it's well, we would like SMEs actually to look at it, and hopefully we've pitched it at the right level. Although we accept that having a document which is 180 pages isn't something that they're going to be able to digest necessarily very quickly. But yes, we've tried to make it as clear as possible within the tasks that we had to do.
Yeah, Marty's got her hand up.
Yeah, I can add to that. That based on the stakeholder interaction that we had, that were specifically directed to questions. Okay, is this appropriate for also for SME? Based on that, we looked at the language, but also implemented a lot of tables and figures that helps understanding everything we do, especially. If I speak for my part, for the management of operations, we looked at how to address that to make it more digestible, so to say.
Yeah, and we took that up with our testers as well, trying to find some SMEs to do the testing to get feedback on language layout approaches. So really trying to aim it at them, and then somebody at a larger company is able to look at it and take the pieces that they need. And maybe they've covered most of it, but not all of it already.
Yeah.
in terms of individual roles within an organization, we did have an alignment early on in the process that we hope that the sort of role would be a quality manager, perhaps at a site who has some awareness or accountability for allergen management. That kind of community is one of the main target audiences.
Yeah, I have another question that I'm going to address this one myself. It was asking about one of the recent incidents in the supply chain where you find out how different countries react to any quantities or any quantitative risk assessment, and asking if there's a common way of working where one country has strict rules, but what about the other? It's something that we have to deal with as companies or an industry that produces products for multiple countries, and not all risk managers or risk assessors react in the same way or have a common way of working. That's one of the difficulties right now, that you might have a very low level, such as the example in the question of soy lecithin, and peanut, having different reactions in different countries, or different reactions within a company at different sections and in different teams. That's one reason our document doesn't specifically endorse a certain risk management strategy. We don't endorse reference doses of a certain type, but more try to illustrate there are different approaches used by different companies. And we've made a guidance to help the data gathering process and really systematize that so you can have an informed conversation across countries on different levels. And hopefully by getting that to a deeper understanding of the data gathering and what's possible, we can have a more informed discussion during a risk assessment or possible risk management discussion. Does anybody else want to add to that?
No.
All right. Then I have run out of questions in the chat. So I'd like to thank these three speakers, everyone who was sending me direct messages with the questions. And I'd like to bring Michael on screen to give us some of our closing statements and finish up the webinar.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone for listening and attending today, particularly those from parts of the globe where it's early morning or late at night. We really ought to get a bit better at inclusive global timing, I guess. So the black and white that we've published is a large document, and we realize it may be daunting. This webinar is one of the ways we make it easier for you to use the guidance that we've produced. And the webinar will continue to be available online. And please encourage your colleagues up and down the supply chain to look at it in conjunction with the guidance document as a whole. And you may not want to read the guidance end to end in one sitting, although you can do so if you wish. But there are quick links at the start of the guidance to the various sections, and the document's made as easy as possible to navigate by bringing you back to the table of contents when you want to go there. There will be further training videos about various sections of the guidance, and they'll be available on the landing page where the publication is available for downloading. The process of developing the guidance was initiated by the ILSI Europe Food Allergy Task Force, currently chaired by Dr. Simon Flanagan. And the successful outcome we celebrate today resulted from the generous time given by the expert group members, the academics, the consultants, the food industry members and public sector members, and the working group leaders that you've heard from. Marty, Neil and Renee carried a particularly heavy burden and load. But we celebrate too and thank the stakeholder group members who gave generously of their time and expertise to help us, the peer reviewers whose constructive critique of drafts, near final draft, we particularly valued. And then, of course, the ILSI Secretariat, Angeliki, who earlier this year handed over to Torben, and Trula and the staff in ILSI Europe. Thank you for your always pleasant, helpful help with getting this large document finally published. And it's my pleasant task to thank you all. And on behalf of the whole expert group, I have a special word of thanks for Ben Remington. Ben steered the group both strategically and tactically. And he did this with considerable expertise and a calm and open demeanor. And that helped us work through some very technically challenging problems in allergen QRA. I want to pay tribute to his leadership. And it's in no small measure due to him we got past the finishing line at more or less the time we thought, well, finally that we would. And it's also interesting to note that in the last 6 months, Ben and his wife have welcomed a lovely little baby into their household. Unlike many of my generation, Ben has evidently shouldered his fair share of parental responsibility, as we have charmingly seen on screen from time to time. Though ILSI Europe isn't resting on its food allergen laurels, a new expert group is underway, and it's looking at criteria for unintended allergen presence and how that bears on precautionary allergen labeling, and that follows through from one of the questions we were asked today. So we've come to the end of this particular webinar, and we've come to the end of the task we set ourselves. My final plea to you who are listening would be to circulate the guidance, to use it, to encourage your colleagues to make use of it, and we look forward to any comments you may have. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day or night. All the very best.
That would then mark the end of the webinar. On behalf of ILSE Europe, I would like to take the opportunity to first, of course, thank all the speakers of today. As Michael just said, for all the amazing work that you have put in through the last couple of years. And last of all, of course, thank you for participating in today's event. And yeah, feel free to look at the guidance document as extensively as you want. And you can ask us any questions at any point by just dropping an email. Again, thank you for participating today. Thank you for joining this webinar. Thank you.